Good afternoon. Let's talk further about our study in the Gospel of John. When we prepare to take a trip, especially an extended one, it usually prompts most of us to make an effort to take care of some unfinished business. Perhaps you had that nagging feeling before, maybe after you got on the plane and you took off. Did I take care of this or did I do that? Maybe questions come to mind, or at least things we ought to consider. Have I paid all the bills that will come due during our time away? Have we arranged to have the pets taken care of? Is a friend or neighbor keeping an eye on our house? Or maybe the old standard, honey, did you forget to turn off the stove? Well, again, if you're going to be gone for a while, it's best to think about these things and take care of them before you leave. Here in the last chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus is nearly ready to return to his Father in heaven. We call that the Ascension. But this isn't the first time we're hearing about it in this Gospel, of course. As early as John chapter 7 and verse 33, Jesus started talking about the relative shortness of his ministry. In John 7:33, he said, "For a little while longer I am with you, then I go to him who sent me." Again, that was a little ways before the cross, but the closer we get toward the end of the Gospel of John, Jesus brings this idea up again and again. In John chapter 13 and verse 36, Peter asked Jesus, "Lord, where are you going?" Of course, this is on the heels of Jesus talking about this kind of thing. Jesus answered, "Where I go, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow later." Then in John 14, verses 2 and 3, some well-known verses in the Gospel of John, Jesus said, "In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. For I go to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, then I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." And more recently, in chapter 16 and verse 7, Jesus says, "But I tell you the truth, it is to your advantage that I go away. For if I do not go away, the Helper will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you." So again, especially in chapters 14 through 17, just before the cross, Jesus talks a great deal to his apostles, his chosen ones, about the fact that he's going to be leaving. But before Jesus leaves, just like we talked about in our opening illustration, Jesus has some unfinished business that needs attention. He's going, if you will, on a long distance journey, at least from our perspective. But he has some last minute details he needs to address before he goes back to the Father. As I studied this chapter, it appears to me that Jesus appears to his disciples in this context with two main purposes in mind. Number one will be a time of reminder, and then number two, a restoration. Let's first talk about what we read in the early verses of chapter 21 about the reminder. This will be verses 1 through 14 of John 21. I would encourage you to open your own Bibles and follow along, if you will. Makes it easier to kind of follow the flow of the context. This is the reminder, verses 1 through 14. Jesus here reminds his disciples of the following. Let me read, first of all, verses 1 through 5. And we see here one of the reminders he has for them is of the limitations of human endeavor. The limitations of human endeavor. This is verses 1 through 5. It says, "After these things, Jesus manifested himself again to his disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, or Sea of Galilee. And he manifested himself in this way: Simon Peter and Thomas called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and two of his other disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, 'I am going fishing.' And they said to him, 'We will also come with you.' They went out and got into a boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. So Jesus said to them, 'Children, you do not have any fish, do you?' They answered him, 'No.'" Now, one question that may come to mind as we start into chapter 21 here is, why are the disciples in Galilee? If you've been following our study, or you know the gospel, that in chapter 20, right up to the end, The disciples are still in Jerusalem, right? They've experienced the crucifixion of their Lord and Master, and they end up huddling for fear of repercussions of that. And Jesus appears to them a few times there in Jerusalem. But here we go into chapter 23, and all of a sudden, the apostolic group is in near the Sea of Galilee. Well, the reason the disciples are here is because Jesus instructed them to go to this place. In Matthew chapter 28 and verse 7, this is, of course, one of the women of the disciple group is told to go tell the disciples that Jesus is risen from the dead, and behold, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Behold, I have told you. So they have instructions to meet Jesus there. Then in Matthew 28, verse 16, it says, but the 11 disciples proceeded to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had designated. So this was a planned meeting. Some suggest, as they study chapter 21, that Peter here was making a choice to return to his earlier profession. Right? Did you catch that there in verse 3 of chapter 21? It says, Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing, and some agree to go with him. Some read that and say, well, Peter is kind of thrown in the towel. He says, I grew up being a fisherman. That was my job before I became a disciple. So that's what I'm going back to. And they kind of link that, of course, to his denial of Jesus. And they say, well, Peter's giving up at this point, and I'm going to go back to fishing. That appears to me, as I study the text, to be reading too much into it. It could be as simple as, while waiting for the appearance of Jesus, these men decide to do some fishing to pass the time. That seems to be, to me, a straightforward reading of the text, rather than attributing some motive here to Peter that it doesn't really say anything about. Now, we'll go on to read that Peter is distressed over some things, but again, I think this is just a good passage to talk about another principle here about being careful not to read more into the text than is there. Sometimes, especially Bible scholars, like to come up with a novel approach to something, look at something a way somebody else hasn't, and they come up with these theories. But once again, I think we need to rein that in sometimes. Again, perhaps the men just, they've gone to Galilee as Jesus has said. They're waiting for him to appear, and we just as well do some fishing to pass the time. In any case, regardless, Jesus does arrive as he promised to, and uses the situation to remind the disciples of the possible limits of human endeavors. That's what I pointed out here. I think is what's going on as far as this first reminder in verses 1 through 5. They went out fishing, it says, and they've caught nothing. Their expertise, and some of these were seasoned fishermen, their expertise yielded zero results from a night of fishing. Jesus says, any fish? Catch any fish? Of course, the answer they have to provide is nope. Perhaps the time will come after the ascension of Jesus. Remember, Jesus told them he's going away. Maybe the time's going to come after the ascension of Jesus when the fires of persecution will begin to burn bright. And it's at those times that the old way of life may be tempting. Okay? You can easily see that happening. The struggle gets bad enough. These men are going to be tempted perhaps to go back to the old way of life. And when that happens, it's going to be helpful for each of these men to remember that, as we will see shortly, the presence of Jesus can turn failure into success. So Jesus uses this night of fishing where they catch nothing to emphasize the fact there are still some limitations to human endeavor. And that's important for what he's going to teach them as we continue on. So number one, we've got the first reminder, a reminder of human limitation, verses 1 through 5. Secondly, we see a reminder here of the power and knowledge of Jesus in verses 6 through 8. This is in contrast to the limitations of the men. Notice what we read, John 21, verses 6 through 8. On the heels of them answering, we haven't caught anything, Lord. It says, he said to them, cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you will find a catch. So they cast, and then they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. When that This, therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." So when Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put his outer garment on, for he was stripped for work, and he threw himself into the sea. But the other disciples came in a little boat, for they were not far from land, but about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish at this point. So up to this point, the men didn't know it was Jesus. And this miraculous catch of fish immediately brings to their minds an incident earlier in their apprenticeship with the Lord. I have to believe this would have just popped into their minds with this encounter of just throwing the net on the other side at the instigation of this man. They didn't know who he was at this point. The net is full. They say, "Wow, we've experienced this before." We read in Luke chapter 5, verses 4 through 7 of another instance of a miraculous catch of fish. This is at the calling of Peter and the others. Luke 5, verse 4 and following says, "When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, or Peter, 'Put out into the deep water and let your nets down for a catch.' Simon answered and said, 'Master, we worked hard all night and caught nothing, but I will do as you say and let down the nets.' When they had done this, they enclosed a great quantity of fish, and their nets began to break. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat for them to come and help. And they came and filled both of the boats, so they began to sink." Again, I can't see how they wouldn't have thought of this event in view of what has just happened to them. You see, this is far more than just a matter of choosing the wrong side of the boat from which to cast their net. Okay. This, I believe, is a miracle, once again, by the power and knowledge of Jesus. And it helps to remind them, again, that they're not being left by Jesus here on earth to flounder around in their life and ministry on the basis of their own power and knowledge. It's a reminder of what Jesus has done throughout his ministry and has continued to do that to the point of right up to his ascension, reminding these men that by the power of Jesus and by the knowledge of Jesus, they can accomplish what they weren't able to accomplish on their own merits. Finally, one more reminder we can talk about that Jesus brings up in this situation, and that's a reminder of the provision of Jesus. That's verses 9 through 14. John 21, 9 through 14. Notice what the story goes on to record. It says, "So when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid, and fish placed on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, 'Bring some of the fish which you have now caught.' Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land, full of large fish, 153, although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, 'Come and have breakfast.' None of the disciples ventured to question him, 'Who are you?' knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. This is now the third time that Jesus was manifested to the disciples after he was raised from the dead." So this gracious act of providing a meal for these hungry men, they've worked all night, should have also brought to mind something else they had witnessed earlier in their training, right? Remember back in chapter 6, verses 11 and through 14, really the whole chapter devoted to this, but in the early stages of John 6, Jesus tells the disciples to find a way to feed a huge crowd of people. And all they had was just a meager amount of bread and fish. And in John 6, verses 11 through 14, it reads, "Jesus then took the loaves and having given thanks, he distributed to those who were seated. Likewise also of the fish as much as they wanted. When they were filled, he said to his disciples, 'Gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing will be lost.' So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. Therefore, when the people saw the sign which he had performed, they said, 'This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world.'" So these men had experienced this miraculous provision before at the hands of Jesus. And here, right before his ascension, Jesus once again is providing for these men. They couldn't catch anything, but Jesus has breakfast ready. The disciples here, and it's part of the reminder, I believe, are not being left to depend on their own resources as they continue the ministry of Jesus. This simple act on the part of Jesus serves as a reminder that God has their needs in mind. Okay? Just because Jesus is going back to heaven doesn't mean that God won't continue to find ways to provide for them. He may do it by miracle, he may do it through other means, but God isn't leaving them alone. So that's the first half, really, of the chapter. Verses 1 through 14 talks about these reminders Jesus is making to these men before he returns to the Father. Now let's turn our attention to the last part of the chapter. That's verses 15 through 25. And rather than a reminder, now we're going to talk about the restoration. There's a restoration to be undertook. Again, one of those details Jesus is buttoning up before his ascension. Jesus here in these verses seeks to mend the relationship with Peter that was damaged by his denials. See, it hasn't been long before this point where Peter vehemently denied that he even knew Jesus. And that was a crushing blow to their relationship. Jesus here, first of all, in verses 15 through 17, restores Peter's sense of mission. We see a unique insight into the ministry of Jesus here and reaching out to Peter in this situation, right? Last time, their relationship went through some damage because of Peter's denial, mostly on Peter's end of it, right? Jesus never abandoned Peter, but Peter had to be feeling pretty low. But notice what it reads, John 21, 15 through 17. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, Lord, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my lambs. John, verse 16, 21, 16. He said to him again a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, shepherd my sheep. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. Once again, the events surrounding the crucifixion of Jesus, and particularly Peter's repeated denials of the Lord, must have shaken him to the very core of his being. Perhaps Peter thinking back to the bold declarations earlier when he said, Lord, I'll never desert you. All may leave, but I won't. And bold things Peter said, but when when crunch time came, Peter caved. Imagine living with that through the crucifixion and then in the absence of Jesus for a short time. I have to believe Peter was shaken to the very core of his being. It's easy to imagine that he could have been left feeling useless and defeated, maybe wondering, how can I carry on this mission that Jesus was training him for? Well, here in these verses, with loving concern on the part of the master, Jesus provides an opportunity for Peter to reaffirm his love for him as many times as he denied him. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and 3 times here, as Jesus seeks to restore Peter's sense of mission, Jesus gives him an opportunity to affirm his love 3 times. Although painful for Peter, and even this restoration process of part of his mission here, it says the 3rd time, it says it grieved him. And again, my guess was the reminder, Peter's putting 2 and 2 together. But even though it was painful for Peter, this part of the restoration was vital for the work that Peter was yet to accomplish for the Lord. Not only did you catch in the verses, did Jesus give Peter the opportunity to reaffirm his love 3 times, but he also issues his marching orders 3 times as well. Tend my lambs, shepherd my sheep, tend my sheep. So Jesus, again, restoring Peter's sense of mission. Just because of his failure doesn't disqualify him for the task to which he'd been originally called. So Jesus restores this sense of mission. Jesus also restores Peter's call to discipleship in verses 18 through 23. Jesus restores Peter's call to discipleship. Here, Jesus reminds Peter that discipleship will continue to be costly. That's verses 18 and 19. Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were younger," Jesus is speaking to Peter directly, "when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you to where you do not wish to go." Now, this he said, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." All right. So, in essence, there, Jesus here is re-emphasizing to Peter. Yes, he's restoring him back to his mission, but it will continue to be a costly one for Peter. Things won't necessarily get better after the ascension of Jesus. In fact, history records that the fires of persecution for these men would flame up very, very highly. But following Jesus has certainly been costly for Peter up to this point, and that wasn't going to change for Peter anytime soon. Jesus describes the situation, as it says in verse 19, this idea of having his hands stretched out and someone else will gird you and bring you to where you not wish to go. And Jesus is making an allusion to the death that through which Peter would glorify God. And the Bible doesn't record it, but other histories record that Peter was crucified as well for his stand for the faith. So discipleship is going to continue to be costly for Peter and the others. Jesus had told them that earlier in chapter 15 and verse 20. Remember what Jesus said? He says, "Remember the word that I said to you, a slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also." So, this restoration to discipleship will be a costly one for Peter and the others. But he also reminds Peter in verses 20 through 23 that discipleship is an intensely personal thing as well. Not only will it be costly, but it's personal. Notice what it says, verse 20 through 23. It says, Peter, he's just heard these words of Jesus talking about the death by which he would die. Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, and the one who had also leaned back on his bosom at the supper and said, "Lord, who is the one who betrays you?" So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, "And Lord, what about this man?" Jesus said to him, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me." Therefore, this saying went out among the brethren that disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but only, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you?" So when this discussion of discipleship focuses on the cost or the struggle that will continue to accompany it, Peter does what probably most of us do. We start to seek to divert attention away from ourselves towards someone else. Peter seeks to do that here, but Jesus gently draws him back to the matter at hand. In essence, Peter brings up John, and Jesus is having none of that. No, he says, that's nothing for you to worry about. John's discipleship is something between him and me. I'm talking about your discipleship in following me. In fact, Jesus says very, very directly there, he says, "You follow me. You, Peter. Don't worry about John. Don't worry about Thomas. Don't worry about any of the other disciples. You follow me." So that's why we're saying discipleship is intentionally personal. Jesus is reminding Peter of that here. Now, I would affirm that discipleship certainly has a horizontal aspect. Okay, so we're not saying that, well, my relationship with the Lord is just between me and him, and I don't care about the rest of the body of Christ. No, there's other relationships that are part of discipleship, but discipleship's primary focus is on each individual's responsibility to follow Jesus. When you boil it down, am I willing to be a follower of Jesus? And am I willing to pay the price? And Jesus is reminding Peter of that. The chapter here ends with 2 verses, and I'm just calling it John's postscript. John gets to the end of his writing here about the life of Jesus, and he says this, verses 24 and 25. He says, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written. So a couple of things John is doing here as he draws things to a close in this gospel. First of all, John asserts the validity of his testimony regarding the life of Jesus. He's referring to himself there in verse 24, and throughout the gospel, we've seen John's reticence to identify himself. He by name, he talks about being the disciple whom Jesus loved and that type of thing. He keeps doing that here, but in essence, he's saying, what I'm telling to you, what I'm writing to you are the facts. I'm a witness to these very things. So John says, I'm not passing on hearsay in this gospel. I was there. My witness is true. It reminds me of what he said back in John 19, verse 35, a couple chapters ago. There John says, and the one who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth so that you also may believe. So right here at the end, John is just affirming the fact, I'm telling you the truth about these events. When John writes his letters to other Christians toward the end of the New Testament, in 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, do you remember what's said there? John says, what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life, and the life was manifested, and we have seen and testified and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested to us. So once again, John affirming he was part of that group that was blessed to be able to see Jesus in the flesh, to listen to him, to touch him. He's a firsthand witness to these things. And there's no valid reason to doubt his testimony in any way, shape, or form. So John asserting the validity of his testimony. And then in verse 25, John reminds us, the reader, that much more could have been written. All right. He says there again in verse 25, and there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that were written. John is just re-emphasizing that he's been selective with what he's wrote, right? Basically, John just covered, a sample of the events of the things Jesus said and did, but they were enough to accomplish his purpose. Remember the purpose statement in the Gospel of John back in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31? Again, John emphasizes that there were other things Jesus did. He says, therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. All right? So while many other things could have been written, what John says, what I've testified to you in this gospel is enough for you to come to faith in in the claims of Jesus and what John is trying to do, that you may have life through faith in Jesus Christ. I've recorded enough for that to happen. I'm a valid witness. I'm an eyewitness, and I've told you enough to cultivate faith. So what are some takeaways we could take away from this final chapter in the Gospel of John? I've got 3 I'll share with you. First takeaway, I think we should always remember that Jesus never leaves his followers without everything they need to practice their discipleship. Here in this final chapter, Jesus, just shortly before his ascension back to the Father in heaven, reminds these men, and through them, us as well, that we are never at a loss in practicing our discipleship as well. Yes, it'll take different forms from the call of the discipleship that the apostles had, but yet I think the promise is still valid. It's not by our own resources. It's not by our own power that we make things happen for God. We follow God as disciples. We follow his lead and take the opportunities he gives us to serve, but we don't have to rely on our own ingenuity. God will continue to provide. He never leaves us alone or deserts us. And We'll never hit a point where we don't have what we need to accomplish what he calls us to do. So remember that. Takeaway number two is that we serve a God of second chances. And I love this lesson. What a great picture in this chapter of Jesus restoring a fallen disciple. Peter had messed up big time, but it wasn't like Jesus catches up with Peter and says, you know what, if you're going to deny me 3 times, then I'm done with you. I can't have someone who's not willing to stand up for their faith and up for me as an apostle. No, Jesus does none of that. Jesus lovingly offers Peter a chance at restoration, another chance, a second chance, if you will. And that's another quality of God's blessings for a disciple that I think we can cling to. God longs to give us every chance we need to fulfill his desires for us. Yes, we may mess up big time like Peter messed up, but if we don't surrender our faith, if we're willing to endeavor once again to follow God, even in the midst of our own failures, that God is willing to honor that. And I'm thankful I have a God of second chances. Then finally, takeaway number 3, just a reminder to us all that we need to concentrate on our own call to follow Jesus before we become too concerned about another's call to follow Jesus. Peter tried to divert attention away from himself to John, and Jesus says, no, I'm not going to have none of that. You follow me. Yes, we are called to minister to one another in the body of Christ, and I should become concerned if I see a brother or sister going down a path that's dangerous to them. So we're not saying, well, I've got my relationship with Jesus, I don't care what anybody else does. No, we're not saying that. But first of all, we need to be more concentrated on our own call to discipleship before we become too concerned with another's call to follow Jesus. You see the difference, don't you? Yes, I can be concerned about the discipleship of another brother or sister, but my first priority is to make sure my own discipleship is what God wants it to be. And Jesus reminded Peter of that. And I think through this text, we can be reminded of it as well. Thank you for being on this journey with me. If you followed along in these lessons, we've been at this now for nearly a year, perhaps a little over, but it's been a great study from my perspective. I hope you've learned some things about your walk in following Jesus. And I thank God for the opportunity to take the witness of a first-hand testifier like John is, to know these facts about my Lord and to build my faith. And I hope your faith has been encouraged as well. God bless and have a great rest of the week.